Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. You know these names. They are engraved on the marble of American history, carved into university gates, library facades, and even the granite of Mount Rushmore. We are taught to associate them with courage and wartime philanthropy, elite education, and the rise of the United States as a global leader. What almost never gets mentioned is that many of these fortunes began the same way, by flooding China with hard drugs. In the early 1800s, American and British merchants discovered that opium grown in India could be shipped illegally into China for profit margins of roughly 400%. A shipment that cost the equivalent of $100 at the fields could bring in $500 or $600 when sold on the Chinese coast. Scaled up over thousands of chests and thousands of tons, that difference meant unimaginable wealth for a small circle of American families and addiction, poverty, and death for millions of Chinese people. At the center of this hidden story stands Franklin Delano Roosevelt's family. FDR is remembered as the 32nd president, the man who led America through the Great Depression and World War II. His face often shown alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln as a secular saint of democracy. But the money that paid for his elite upbringing, his tutors, and his path to Harvard did not come from some benign China trade. It came from opium. His maternal grandfather, Warren Delano II, spent years in China working for one of the largest American opium firms of the day, building the fortune that would later support FDR's rise. And the Delanos were not an exception. The Astor family, usually described in textbooks as fur traders and real estate barons, the Forbes family, whose name crowns a global business magazine, the Perkins, Russell, and Cabot clans of Boston, even pillars of American higher education like Yale and Harvard, all of them were touched, and in many cases launched by Chinese opium silver. For roughly 200 years, that origin story has been scrubbed from most school curricula, museum exhibits, and official family histories. In public, these families present a spotless record of charity and public service, while the narcotics money that financed their first mansions and endowments is pushed off stage. The same class of people who once made their earliest millions selling illegal drugs overseas later stood at the forefront of criminalizing drugs at home, backing strict narcotics laws that filled American prisons with small-time dealers and addicts. That is the core hypocrisy at the heart of this story, the transformation of America's original drug lords into untouchable heroes, and the deliberate effort sustained over nearly 2 centuries to make sure you never learned how their empires really began. By starting with the numbers, the 400% margins, the thousands of tons shipped, the millions of lives shattered, and with the familiar names etched onto campus, gates, and presidential memorials, this opening rips away the heroic varnish. It invites you to see America's aristocratic families not as spotless founders, but as beneficiaries of a global drug business that they later helped to bury under law, myth, and stone. Not the sanitized museum version, the reality. In the early 1800s, Britain faced a massive economic problem. It was importing huge quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China had little interest in British goods. The Qing Empire demanded payment in silver, and by the 1822, Britain was losing millions of ounces of silver each year. The drain was so severe that British reserves were collapsing. London needed a product the Chinese population would buy in enormous quantities, something addictive, high value, and easy to transport. They found the answer in opium, grown in British-controlled India. Produced cheaply and refined into a smokable form, the drug could be purchased in India for roughly $100 per unit and later sold on the Chinese coast for $500 to $600, generating profit margins of $400 to 500%. Although opium was illegal in China, the profits were irresistible. Smugglers used fast ships, hidden coastal drop-off points, and networks of Chinese middlemen to move thousands of pounds of opium every year. This is where American traders entered the picture. U.S. Clipper ships famous for their unmatched speed could outrun Chinese patrol vessels, making them ideal for illegal delivery runs. American captains sailed from India to offshore anchorages near Canton, never entering official ports. Chinese smugglers rowed out to meet them, exchanged silver for opium, and vanished back into the coves and estuaries. This system gave American merchants plausible deniability. Technically, they never stepped foot on Chinese soil. The result was a massive flow of Chinese silver into American and British hands. By the 1832, this silver financed the rise of powerful American families who reinvested their opium profits into railroads, factories, and real estate. And in America, the families getting rich from this used the money to build legitimate empires. Let's look at who they were. Let's start with the most famous, the Delanos, FDR's family. Warren Delano II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's maternal grandfather, arrived in China as a teenager and quickly rose through the ranks of Russell and Company, the largest American opium trading firm operating in Canton. By age 24, he was already a partner overseeing large-scale shipments of opium from British-controlled India into China. For more than 13 years, he managed and expanded the company's narcotics operations, earning a fortune substantial enough to return to the United States as one of the wealthiest men in New York State. With that money, Delano built a lavish 40-room mansion in Newburgh, New York, a symbol of the kind of wealth only opium profits could generate in the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds. He used his riches to secure elite education, private tutors, and political access for his children, advantages that would ultimately shape the upbringing of his grandson, FDR. Even when the Panic of 1,857 wiped out a significant portion of his fortune, Delano simply went back to China, re-entered the opium trade, and rebuilt his wealth within a few years. It was quite literally drug money that funded the Roosevelt family's rise. This financial foundation allowed Franklin Delano Roosevelt to enjoy a privileged childhood, to attend Harvard, and enter politics with the backing of one of America's most well-connected families, all rooted in opium profits extracted from China. And yet, in the 1,930 seconds as President FDR signed sweeping narcotics restrictions, including the Marijuana Tax Act of 1,937 tightening drug laws across the nation. The irony is thick. Now let's look at the Astors. John Jacob Astor is often remembered as America's first multimillionaire, a titan of commerce whose fortune supposedly came from the fur trade and savvy real estate investments. But that is only the sanitized version. The truth is far more uncomfortable. In the early 1800s, Astor's ships, including the Macedonian, carried Turkish opium across the Indian Ocean and into the Chinese coast, where the drug was exchanged for massive quantities of silver. That silver was then used to purchase Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, which were sold in the United States and Europe for enormous profit. By 1840, Astor's net worth had climbed to approximately $20 million, with the modern equivalent of roughly $500 million, and a significant share of that wealth came directly from opium trafficking, not fur pelts. The money built the foundations of the Astor Empire, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, libraries, museums, and charitable institutions that still bear the Astor name. What the public sees as old money philanthropy is, in reality, a legacy financed by narcotics funneled into China. The Forbes family followed a similar path. Based in Boston, the Forbes brothers, Robert Bennett Forbes and John Murray Forbes, became major figures in the opium trade during the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds. Working closely with Russell and Company, the largest American opium firm in China, the Forbes brothers operated fast clipper ships that delivered thousands of pounds of opium along the Chinese coastline. Their profits were astronomical for the era. John Murray Forbes funneled his opium earnings into America's rapidly expanding railroad network, becoming one of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in New England by the mid-19th century. Later generations of Forbes heirs used this fortune to establish Forbes magazine, fund mansions, erect statues, and endow public institutions throughout Massachusetts. Yet official histories rarely acknowledge this origin. School textbooks highlight Astor's real estate genius and Forbes's railroad innovation. Museums showcase their philanthropy. Business magazines celebrate their legacy. But the opium trade, the foundation of their wealth, the engine that powered their dynasties, has been erased. No one mentions the opium. It's been scrubbed from the official history. The Perkins family, Thomas Handasid Perkins. In Boston's elite circles of the early 19th century, few names commanded more respect than Thomas Handasid Perkins, often called Boston's Merchant Prince. Publicly, he is remembered as a philanthropist who funded hospitals, libraries, and the Perkins School for the Blind. But the true engine of his wealth was not shipping tea or textiles, it was opium. Perkins spent decades running opium from Turkey and British-controlled India into China, partnering with major trading houses and building a fortune large enough to make him one of the richest men in all of New England. The charitable institutions that still bear his name were financed directly from narcotics profits, though official accounts rarely mention this uncomfortable truth. The network extended far beyond Perkins. Samuel Russell, another towering figure in New England commerce, founded Russell and Company in 1823. Within a decade, it became the dominant American opium firm in China, moving thousands of pounds of the drug through Canton each year. The wealth generated was immense. Samuel's cousin, William Huntington Russell, used the family fortune to co-found Skull and Bones at Yale University in 1832. To this day, the Russell Trust Association created from opium-derived wealth funds the operations of Skull and Bones, a secret society that has produced U.S. presidents, Supreme Court justices, cabinet officials, and CIA directors. Generations of America's political elite passed through an institution rooted in the drug trade. The pattern continues with the Cabot and Lowe families. The Cabot's pillars of Boston Brahmin society earned significant wealth through the China trade, including opium shipments. Meanwhile, the Low family used their opium profits to fund institutions like the Low Memorial Library at Columbia University, one of the most iconic buildings in the Ivy League. These names still decorate campuses, scholarships, and endowments across the Northeast. Taken together, these families formed more than a trading network. They created an industrial-scale narcotics machine. It involved fast ships, fortified warehouses, paid agents, bribed officials, and complex financial channels stretching from Canton to Boston. In China, it was drug trafficking. In America, it was praised as commerce. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking, ships, warehouses, agents, bribes, a full logistical operation. Here's the pattern. The formula behind America's opium fortunes was shockingly straightforward. Elite families traveled to China, smuggled narcotics on an industrial scale, returned to the United States with mountains of silver, and converted that silver into railroads, mansions, banks, universities, museums, and political dynasties. Over the next century, they carefully erased every trace of this criminal origin story from official biographies and institutional histories. What remains in public memory is a sanitized myth of old American wealth, but the real foundation was far darker. Opium and silver out, prestige up. By the 1,830 seconds, American firms controlled roughly 10% of all opium entering China each year. Considering that the global trade involved tens of thousands of chests annually, each chest weighing about 140 pounds, this meant U.S. companies like Russell and Company were moving thousands of chests of opium into China every year. The profit margins were staggering. Opium purchased in India for the equivalent of $100 could be sold on the Chinese coast for $500 to $600, generating returns of 400 to 500% per shipment. For a handful of American families, this was a gold rush disguised as commerce. The human cost in China, however, was catastrophic. By the late 1,830 seconds, an estimated 10 to 12 million people, about 10% of all adult males were addicted to opium. Entire communities were crippled. Farmers abandoned fields. Craftsmen lost their livelihoods. Silver, the backbone of China's monetary system, poured out of the country in enormous quantities to pay foreign drug traders, destabilizing the national economy. Desperate to stop the collapse, the Qing government appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu in 1838 to lead a full-scale crackdown. In 1839, Lin seized and destroyed approximately 1,000 tons of foreign opium in Canton, a bold act meant to save the nation. Britain answered with war. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, open multiple treaty ports, pay massive reparations, and cede Hong Kong to the British. When China again attempted to curb the opium trade, the Second Opium War, 1856-1860, followed, compelling China to open even more ports and effectively legalize opium, making true enforcement impossible. These humiliating defeats marked the beginning of China's so-called Century of Humiliation, a national trauma still remembered today. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American families who helped fuel that devastation were living a very different reality. In Boston, New York, and Connecticut, opium profits built grand mansions, financed railroad empires, and endowed universities whose names still carry prestige today. American families were building mansions and founding universities. The human cost in China was catastrophic. Millions addicted communities shattered, a nation's silver reserves drained, and 2 wars forced upon a country desperate to defend itself. Yet, even after orchestrating one of the largest narcotics operations in world history, America's elite families did something even more astonishing. They reinvented themselves as moral crusaders, leading the very movement to criminalize the drugs that had made them rich. By the early 20th century, long after their opium fortunes had been safely transformed into respectable industries, railroads, shipping, finance, real estate, publishing, and philanthropy, these same families positioned the United States at the forefront of global drug prohibition. In 1912, the U.S. played a major role in pushing the International Opium Convention at The Hague, the first multinational treaty aimed at restricting narcotics trafficking. 2 years later, Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, effectively criminalizing the distribution of opiates and coca-based substances throughout the United States. This pivot was not about ethics. It was about preserving class power and preventing history from repeating itself. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, opium dens brought by Chinese immigrants were appearing in American cities such as San Francisco and New York. The elites feared that what had happened in China, mass addiction, social collapse, and economic devastation, could unfold in the United States. They also feared competition. The last thing they wanted was a resurgence of cheap opium cutting into their now legitimate business empires. So the solution was simple: criminalize the drug trade, stigmatize users, and bury the uncomfortable truth that their own ancestors had once run an international cartel. This moral repositioning gave way to something deeper and more strategic: the deliberate whitewashing of history. As these families accumulated social prestige, they used their wealth to shape how future generations would understand the past. They donated to universities, endowed libraries, funded museums, and financed historical societies, often attaching conditions written or implied about how their contributions and histories would be presented. At the FDR Presidential Library, for example, Warren Delano II's 13-year tenure as an opium trader with Russell and Company is reduced to a polite reference to China trade. The word opium is conspicuously absent. At the Astor Family Historical Societies, John Jacob Astor is celebrated for his fur trading and real estate ventures, while his ship, the Macedonian, known to have carried Turkish opium to Canton, is rarely mentioned. The Forbes family enjoys a legacy of railroad innovation, magazine publishing, and philanthropy, while their substantial profits from opium shipments in the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds are almost completely scrubbed from mainstream biographies. Universities followed the same pattern. Yale proudly displays the legacy of Skull and Bones without acknowledging that Samuel Russell's opium money helped found it. Harvard honors buildings named after opium-linked donors like the Cabots. Columbia University's Lowe Memorial Library stands as a monument built with funds from a family enriched by the China trade, including narcotics. In each case, the connection isn't denied, it's simply omitted, blurred, or softened until the truth fades from public consciousness. And yet the evidence still exists, just not where the average American will ever see it. Shipping records documenting tons of opium transported on American ships. Account books listing silver payments from Chinese brokers. Personal letters describing smuggling techniques, bribes, and profit margins of 400 to 500%. Academic studies meticulously detailing the American role in the opium trade. Specialized books like When America First Met China and The Opium Clippers that compile primary sources ignored by mainstream textbooks. These materials exist in archives, university collections, and historical research centers, but they are conspicuously absent from public school curricula, museum tours, and national narratives. Through endowments, influence, and public relations, these families successfully rewrote themselves into the story of America as philanthropists, nation builders, and guardians of morality. They shaped how history would remember them and how it would forget their crimes. They used the immense wealth and institutional power created by the opium trade to curate their own reputations, bury their origins, and construct an image of untouchable respectability. And they could ensure their descendants lived in luxury, never confronting what their ancestors did. That closing thought opens the door to an uncomfortable but necessary comparison with the modern era. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, journalists uncovered allegations that elements of the CIA allowed cocaine to flow into American inner cities to fund anti-communist rebels in Latin America. The resulting crack epidemic devastated black communities, contributed to mass incarceration, and triggered nationwide outrage once exposed. Even though the full truth is still debated, the key point remains: Americans understood that a government or elite institution might allow drugs to destroy communities if it served a political or economic goal. Now the video asks viewers to apply that same logic to the 19th century. American families, Delano Astor, Forbes, Russell, Perkins, Cabot, did not merely participate in the opium trade, they engineered it, expanded it, and profited from it while millions of Chinese people became addicted. They then used the resulting wealth to build the institutions that define modern America: Ivy League universities, museums, political dynasties, and philanthropic foundations. If this happened today, if a group of American billionaires secretly operated a fentanyl cartel in Mexico, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, and then used the profits to endow Harvard or fund political campaigns, most Americans would see it as monstrous. Yet that is essentially what happened 150-200 years ago. The only difference is time and selective memory. That brings us to the stark contrast between historical memory in China and the United States. In China, the Opium Wars and the ensuing century of humiliation are central to the national identity. Every student learns how foreign powers forced opium onto the country, drained its silver, weakened its government, and carved out spheres of influence. The trauma is remembered, studied, and passed down. In the United States, by contrast, most citizens cannot explain what the Opium Wars were, let alone that American families helped fund them. Few know that U.S. merchants controlled roughly 10% of the opium flowing into China by the 1,830 seconds. Even fewer know that the same families used opium money to found elite institutions still revered today. China remembers what was done to them. America forgets and whitewashes what we did, and the families that profited are happy to keep it that way. The contrast is staggering. For nearly 2 centuries, America has celebrated the Delanos, Astors, Forbes, Perkins, Russells, Cabots, and Lowes as pillars of industry, philanthropy, and national leadership. Their names appear on universities, museums, hospitals, foundations, and presidential libraries. Yet these same families built their earliest fortunes by moving thousands of chests of opium, each weighing roughly 140 pounds, into China, fueling an addiction crisis that consumed 10 to 12 million people and helped trigger 2 devastating wars. The evidence is not speculation. It exists in shipping ledgers, merchant letters, British diplomatic records, and American corporate documents. This is not conspiracy theory. This is history. So, what do we do with this knowledge? First, we speak the truth plainly. We say the names out loud: Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, Cabot, Lowe. These were not merely merchant families or participants in the China trade. They were drug traffickers on an industrial scale. Millions of Chinese lives were destroyed as a direct result of their business decisions. Their mansions, endowments, and early political influence were financed by narcotics, not by virtue, innovation, or hard work. Second, we acknowledge the staggering hypocrisy. The same families that made fortunes selling illegal drugs overseas spent the early 20th century helping criminalize those same substances at home. They supported the 1912 Hague Opium Convention, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, and later policies that turned addiction into a crime. They built America's moral posture on drugs while ensuring that no one ever asked where their own wealth came from. Third, we question the institutions built with this money. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and elite museums, from New York to Boston, all benefited directly or indirectly from opium profits. Should these institutions publicly acknowledge their origins, issue apologies, fund historical transparency projects, or even consider some form of restorative action? These questions are uncomfortable but necessary. Because the truth is this: the descendants of these families still enjoy wealth, status, and influence built on Chinese suffering. Their names decorate buildings, their foundations steer policy, their legacy is treated as noble, while the origins of that legacy remain hidden. This story matters not just because it reveals a dark chapter of American history, but because it forces us to ask who gets to write history and whose pain is erased in the process. The opium families got away with it for 200 years, but the truth doesn't stay hidden forever, and I'll keep digging it.